Okay, so at the end of this talk, we're going to begin by talking about culture and how it explains you, but also how it fails to explain you. And at the end of this talk, I want you to leave not with clear definitions in your mind, but maybe even a little bit confused. And that would be good, because that means you would leave this room with something to reflect on and with a way of looking at the world and questioning what's immediately before you rather than taking it for granted. So where is culture to be found? In a bottle of Yakult? Yes, live culture, that's what it says, right? On recto among street vendors? Yes. Okay. In the grocery? Yes. In the cultural center of the Philippines? Yes. In a factory or food processing facility? Somewhat. And yes, here. In Far Eastern University? Yes. In the ancestral domains of indigenous peoples? Yes. Is there anywhere here that there is more culture or less culture? In any of these things, there is culture to be present because of human involvement and because it's part of our society. And we cannot say that there's more culture, for example, in the ancestral domains of indigenous peoples than in a grocery store. It's just different cultures, but both have culture. But who tells us what our culture is? Is it the National Commission on Culture and Arts? No? Okay, you're shaking your head. Is it the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples? Not really. So my first question, you were more sure. Now you're not so sure. I wonder why. Is it the Department of Education? Is it the Commission on Higher Education that tells us what our culture is? Somehow, and also a no, and a maybe. The church? Yes. The President of the Philippines? What did you say? No. You? Yeah. Maybe. Okay. All of these try to tell us what our culture is, but we're going to touch on why that's problematic, that there are institutions or entities that can tell us what our culture is, whether or not they're accurate. So culture is not dance, it's not clothing or costumes, but if you tell an indigenous person wearing their clothes that they're wearing costumes, in a way you're offending their culture because those are their clothes, that's their identity, that's their tradition. Culture is not sculpture, culture is not cinema, and I know that you know this already because you were able to identify all the places where you can find culture, and it's not just in the cultural center of the Philippines. Okay. So what is it made up of? It's dance, it's clothing or costumes, it's sculpture, it's cinema, but it's also language, it's also food, it's also ritual, it's also norms and institutions, including policing institutions, which can say what's right and what's not, what's sinful and what's not. So beliefs, religion, cosmology, myths and stories, knowledge and structures or systems for passing it on or acquiring it. Laws are part of our culture. Kinship, or how we define who our relatives are. So for example, in some matrilineal societies, you wouldn't consider your father's relatives as your relatives. Only your mother's relatives would be your relatives, and you would identify your uncle, for example, as your father rather than your biological father. So it's not the same all over the world. Resources and how we use them. How we define property. This is mine, that's yours. This can be shared, that cannot be shared. how we see nature. Is it outside or inside? Is it far or is it near? Am I connected to it or not? How we treat each other. Paggalang sa mas matanda, and other ways of interacting with one another. And also how we perceive and treat plants and animals. So culture is all of these things, but this is not entirely what culture is. Saan tayo dito? Okay. But before we go into that, I want to show you a picture. So what do you see here? A ritual. Okay, yes. What else?
Women and children.
Men. Okay, so participation of men, women, and children. So you see several generations. So a little background. This is in Hapaw, Hungduan, in Ifugao. And every year they hold what they call the Punok. And the Punok is a post-harvest feast where they celebrate that they've harvested their rice. And the different community members, there are 3 villages, they go down to the river and they play tug of war in the river, and there are all kinds of games. So what you can see here is status and roles. So this man, oh, it won't show because it's green. You see the elder there? So he's a Mombaki or a ritual specialist and a leader. So before they began this march, he had to say some prayers and carry out some rituals. And he's a very respected figure in the community. So Mombaki is his status. And as a Mombaki, he has roles that he performs in the society. And then you see the men and the children. So you mentioned the generation. So we have transmission happening here. Nobody's telling the children this is what we do during Punok. But every year they participate in the Punok, and that's how they learn this tradition. But this is also an image of renewal or revitalization, because the Punok ritual disappeared for several decades. They stopped practicing it. And in the 1990s, in 1998 to be exact, so just 2 weeks ago, this was the 20th anniversary of the renewal and revival of this very important community ritual. And last year, it was recognized by UNESCO as part of our intangible world heritage. So you also see renewal, revitalization, and indigenous resurgence, because for indigenous peoples, renewing ritual or practicing them again is a way of asserting their power and their right to self-determination in a nation that is so plagued by a history of colonization, internal as well as external. So we also see time and space. So the element of time here is that who would have known that in 1998 or even in the 1980s that this ritual could come back to life and that the community would find value in performing this ritual again. And the way we see space being used here is you see where the houses are, usually the rice terraces surrounding them belong to the people who live in those houses. What you don't see here are the rice granaries, which are farther out from the community. So every community or culture has their own way of laying out space, who gets to stay in what space and why. So, diba, we're taught in colonial history, for example, one of the most powerful spaces in the urbanizing areas was the plaza. And whoever had houses near the church were the more elite in society. Okay, what do you see here? Women, okay, yep.
We are going towards a place.
Okay, they're going somewhere.
Right, down.
Down, okay. What else? And you see a river here, yeah. And you see that up here, it's not, the forest is still there. So what I wanted to show you in this picture is human-environment relations, which is also part of culture and part of who you are and who we are collectively. So you don't see it in the landscape, but most of the hard work of planting and harvesting rice is done by women. The work of the men is to build and maintain the rice terraces. So you also see gender in this picture. So you saw the women, you noticed the women. You also see that the Ifugao tradition called the Muyong. So these are owned by clans, and these are forest lots that cannot be deforested because then they would have problems with their water, because they're aware that this is a watershed and that's where their water comes from. And if you look at the rice terraces, this is actually very masterful manipulation and movement of water. So it's a very sophisticated irrigation system. And the river in some cultures are a boundary, but also a meeting place. So these people here on the other side are from the other village, and they're all coming down to meet to celebrate the Punok together. So for us, for example, being in Manila, it would be interesting to think about human environmental relations and Pasig, and how does the Pasig figure in our culture and who we are. Who are the people who live around Pasig, who are vulnerable, who are not, things like that. How about in this picture? What do you see? So here in this picture, I wanted to focus on childhood and what are the important things that children learn. So for example, this is my daughter, okay? And these are our family friends from Hapao and from Ifugao and from Kalinga as well. And these boys are very skilled at handling bolos. Okay? And they started handling bolos at the age of 2. In Manila or in Baguio, in urban centers, you do not hand a child a knife. But I'm telling you, they are skilled. They know what they're doing, and they're not likely to hurt themselves or others with a knife. So you see how childhood is also shaped by our cultural beliefs, and what we think is appropriate and what we think is safe is also shaped by culture. So my daughter, this is her 3rd time to participate in Punok since she was 2 years old. We try to go every other year or every year. So it's not her culture, but she's sharing in it. So culture doesn't just belong to only a certain people, and sometimes culture can close off others. For example, in religion, Iglesia ni Cristo, as an example, is a very secretive church. But sometimes culture can embrace others and include others, as in here. Now, what would you think if I showed you this? Do you know who that is? Or everybody knows Erwan. Okay. So what does this tell you, and how does this change your perception of everything I've shown you before now?
It looks like it's staged.
It looks like it's staged, orchestrated. What else?
There's a panoptic eye
Mm-hmm.
with the function of the camera.
Sorry?
With the function of the camera.
Yes. Okay. So the camera can show you things, but it can also hide things. So is it staged? Is it orchestrated, the Punok?
Debatable.
Mm-hmm. It's debatable. So one way of looking at cultural practice also is, whom is it for? Who is it being done for? Is it performance, or is it for the community? Okay. So is it performed for an audience, or is it performed for the community? So according to the locals, this year was the first year that so many people came from everywhere to attend the Punok. But the other thing, and unfortunately I don't have a picture to show you, the other thing that you don't see here is that the day before all the visitors came, there were rituals that were for the community only. So yes, it's debatable whether it's just staged or orchestrated, but also it would have happened whether or not there was an audience for it, because the community chose So what we're seeing here also is interaction between different people and different cultures. We're seeing processes of knowledge acquisition and knowledge transfer. This could also be read as appropriation. What right does Erwan have to be there taking photographs, and who knows what he's going to use them for later on? I'm not bad-mouthing Erwan or his presence there. It's just a way of analyzing the dynamic that's happening here. And so, of course, when you have a community ritual which people want to see, inevitably it's also going to change. And that's okay. Because culture is not static. And we don't say that a culture is dying or fading or weakening. It's just changing. Okay, so I hope you got this from the previous discussion. Culture isn't dictated, it's learned. So it cannot be dictated by the president or the Cultural Center of the Philippines or the National Commission on Culture and Arts and all these other institutions. But they do play a role in trying to establish a certain kind of acceptable culture or even a national culture, which is part of the whole project of nation building. And we participate in that every day. Okay. So that's why culture can be manipulated and it can be changed. So the question is, by whom? So here's something to take with you when you are done with this lecture. And how? So one of the things to think about in terms of understanding yourself in culture is society. So people and personhood is important. There would not be a society without other people, but you cannot call a people a society either if they didn't share a culture. So it's almost like a chicken or the egg argument. Society has its processes, and these processes are carried on through interaction between people. It has social structures. So social structures can be kinship or family. It doesn't have to be an obvious structure like a university. It can also be social structures of barkada, or it can even be the way space is structured, like the way we have to gain entry to the LRT, for example. There's also a lot of culture there. It's also about power and influence. We see that in society, and it's about change. And ultimately, meaning, making sense, and understanding each other. So let's look at personhood. It starts from being a child. What's interesting is different cultures have different ways of defining when you become an adult. Okay. So also, in different cultures, you acquire gender differently. So if you think about it, when did people start telling you that as a girl, this is how you behave? As a boy, this is how you behave. Or because you're a boy, that's not for you. Because you're a girl, that's not for you. When does that begin? Can you think about that? We're not necessarily going to discuss it, but that's cultural as well. So what work can women do? What work can men do? What work will men refuse to do? Or what work will a woman refuse to do as well? Okay. And then when do you become an adult, or what are the things you can do when you're an adult already? So like the story of the 2-year-old kids and the bolo, that's something that we only think you do that when you're an adult. Plus you have to be skilled. So when do you start acquiring the skills? They start acquiring it when they're little kids. We start acquiring it when we're a little older. Do you become an adult when you get your driver's license? Do you become an adult when you graduate from the university? When do you start adulting? When you pay your own bills, when you have a job. So different cultures have different ways of defining that transition. And you can ask yourself these questions as well. Is it only when when my parents recognize that I'm an adult and stop treating me like a child? Or is it when I decide that I'm an adult? So even that is culturally influenced. Like if you say, I decide when I'm an adult, others might say that's so individualistic, Filipinos aren't like that, and so on and so forth. Just as an example. Okay. Who are the people around you in different stages of your life? This is part of your personhood or who you are as a person. So first we have our family, and then that grows and grows and grows. And then it can also, later on, you can choose to limit that as well by deciding what work you're going to do, what you're going to study, who you're going to be friends with, and so on. So I mentioned statuses and roles earlier. At any given time, any of us can have many statuses. Each of those statuses, you have a set of roles, right? So as a daughter, I'm a different person, or not a different person, but I have different roles to play. As a mother, I also have different roles to play. As your lecturer today, I also have different roles to play. And there's this very old but very useful theory in anthropology by Goffman. There are many criticisms of it, but it's also a very simple way of thinking about personhood. And simple is useful in many ways. So we have a front stage and a backstage. This is my front stage. My backstage might be at home when I'm with my family, or even when I'm sitting at my desk and I'm ignoring everyone around me in the office. That could also be my backstage. So according to this theory, every person, but also every society and every cultural practice has a front stage and a backstage. So personhood is also influenced by processes, interactions, and social structures. So child rearing, gender socialization, education, family, organizations, government, and quite importantly, social class. It's also influenced by time and space, by rites of passage. So the question earlier of when do you become an adult, in many cultures this is defined by a rite of passage, whether it's a graduation or initiation into a fraternity or a sorority, or a promotion at work. So we have these that define stages of life. Sometimes you have to pass a certain test. Okay. It also creates a sense of belonging. So that happens through interaction. It can also create a sense of alienation, in which case we have also such a thing as changing membership, status, and roles. And when we talk about front stage and backstage, we also think of impression management, which I'm doing right now, and which you're also doing right now. And we also think of conformity and compliance. And then we have, as part of our social processes, interactions, and social structures, we have rules. They can be spoken or unspoken, written or unwritten. But for somehow, even if they're unwritten or unspoken, we know them, right? So these are rules for behavior and on a scope of possible actions. But are we limited to this? No. Which is why we have power and change. So anthropologically in the past, nobody talked about power. And then feminist criticism and ecological criticism and also Marxist criticism brought into the picture that you can't really talk about culture without talking about power. Okay, so we have creativity, we have innovation, and we have nonconformity. Okay. I know that's the rule. Lecturers don't say bad words, but that's bullshit. Okay. The ability to influence other people and to make them do what they would not otherwise do. That's power. Okay? The ability to make decisions, to get others to agree to your decisions, and to act on your decisions. That's power, and that can change culture, and that can change society. The ability to do what you want despite existing structures, processes, and accepted ways of interaction. And I would add, it's not here, but social sanctions as well. So sometimes you do something and then the next day you come into school and nobody's speaking to you. You must have done something that was non-conforming, it's possible, and that's the reason you're experiencing this social sanction. Okay. All of this we can summarize as agency. So who has agency? So society can have agency. Institutions can have agency. The church, again, that example. And in more recent anthropological theories and studies, even animals have agency. Even water can be considered an actor in culture, a significant actor in a culture. Even weather can be considered an agent of change. Okay, and they figure in our culture. So why do we build things in a certain way? That's also cultural, but that's also influenced by our environment and our values. So I have this nice big lot and I have lots of money, so I want to show that, and I'm going to build a huge house on the entire lot. That is a cultural demonstration of power and wealth, okay? And an exercise of one's agency. Another way of looking at it is I have this huge lot. I don't have a lot of money, so I'm going to build a small house, but I want to plant a garden and I want to plant food. That's another exercise of agency, and there are cultural influences in that kind of decision making as well. Now, all of this becomes culture when it makes sense. Okay? And it makes sense when we all understand it. But there's also a problematic way of looking at culture. Okay. We have rape culture. Okay. But is it the same as misogyny or sexism? When does it become culture? We've been talking about culture as this nice, sugary, shared, meaningful thing. But there's this as well. So when do we call misogyny or rape? When do we start calling it rape culture? I mean, we say it on social media all the time, right? So what do people mean? It must not be your culture because you're having a hard time. But even people who are guilty of spreading rape culture or influencing rape culture don't realize. So this tells us that you can also have culture and not know it. Okay? So let's go a little further and see if we can figure out when does this become culture. Okay, we also talk about a culture of violence. When is it just violence? And when does it become a culture of violence? We talk about impunity. So when is it just impunity? And then when does it become a culture of impunity? So any wild guesses? It's a specific act and you can identify several instances of it. If you take a step back, you'll see a pattern and you'll see that it's a shared act, a repeated act, and an accepted act. Whether it's right or wrong, that's also subject to debate, right? So it becomes a culture when it's systemic. Okay, and when you see that it's not just one person that's doing it, but several people are involved in the practice or the behavior, and there's transmission. It's passed on as others and accepted as a norm. Anything else? So when you have a powerful institution or entity influencing the act or putting value into it, like we need to do this because this is correct because, and then you have a people or a society that either can accept that or that can reject it and dissent. Okay, so even culture, even dissent itself is a cultural expression. Okay, so yeah, culture is not all just nice and how we get along and how we, it can also be this, unfortunately. And it's good to be aware of that, and it's good to train yourself to see that in your interactions with people around you. So, can we speak of the Filipino culture? Just like, can we speak of the Korean culture? We can describe something that we know it's Filipino culture because we're Filipinos. But when we start to talk, if we spend several hours over coffee or alcohol talking about Filipino culture, we might find at the end of it that we all have a very different idea of what Filipino culture is or what Korean culture is. So this is where reflexivity comes in, and this is where comparison has value. Reflexivity meaning your ability to see your own position in things and how things like your upbringing, your beliefs, your culture, your gender, your status influence the way you perceive others. This is also where stereotypes become problematic. Right? But still, we know that those of us in this room, we share something that we can call Filipino culture, right? So it's very difficult to define culture. So if you've noticed, I've been talking for several minutes and I have not given you a definition of culture, but we've been trying to approach it from many different directions. So yes, we can speak of indigenous people's culture, but we also recognize that this is that there are many indigenous people's cultures. There's not just one stereotypical indigenous person. That's why it's peoples with an S and not people. Which, by the way, was a subject of very political debate about 10, 20 years ago. Peoples. Okay? So we can speak of Roman Catholic culture, but we can also stereotype it, we can also problematize it, we can also malign it. We can also speak of Islamic culture, gaming culture. We can even speak of a culture of research in the university, which is what we want to encourage here. And we can speak of pop culture. Okay. So when we think of culture, we can think of diversity. We can recognize diversity. We can learn from comparing without judging. That's basically what cultural relativism is. So you can compare, but you recognize that the culture, another culture that's very different from yours, can have its own internal logic. So you cannot judge it as good or bad, backward or progressive, savage or civilized, but you try to understand how this culture works and why it values certain things that maybe you don't. That is an attitude, cultural relativism. But it can become problematic if you're overly realistic. Female genital mutilation is a cultural practice, and we're cultural relativists, so that's okay. So even this needs to be, you need to think about it carefully and decide for yourself what's acceptable. Why do I accept this, or why don't I accept this? So cultural awareness is important. This is knowledge. And I didn't touch on it enough earlier, but I want to emphasize that knowledge is power, not in the sense that when you know something, you're powerful, but people can also control what knowledge is accessible to you and what isn't. That is a form of power as well. Okay, so Cultural sensitivity, again, is an attitude where you try not to be insulting or judgmental when you're interacting with people from different cultures, whether it's a different religious culture or a different political culture or a different nation's culture, for example. Although we know within this nation, there's so many different cultures also. So that's an attitude. And then we have cultural competence. So the reflexive part is your ability to see who you are in this space and in this society and in this culture and how you might affect what's taking place during your interactions in that culture. It's also being able to behave in ways that are appropriate for the culture that you're getting in touch with. So if we were, for example, I'm Roman Catholic, but I was raised as a Buddhist, and then if I were to go into a mosque, I would not know whether I've done something offensive or not. So clearly, I'm not culturally competent in that area. So cultural competence is a skill, and if you ask me, my unbiased opinion is that this is a skill people are going to need in the future, increasingly. I mean, we talk about things like computer literacy, etc., being able to analyze big data, but cultural competence is a very important future skill. Okay, and it all comes down again to knowledge, power, and access. All right, so have I given you a sense of how culture explains you? Yeah? So you grow up, you gain an identity and a sense of belonging or not belonging, and you learn how to behave through acquiring culture. Okay. We understand each other now because we share a culture. When you step out of here, you might be stepping into other cultures as well. But how does culture fail to explain you? When is it not enough? So culture fails to explain us or you because it can be manipulated through power and agency so that it becomes meaningless to you, or it represents something you don't believe in, or it becomes something that you can't accept as true or good for you or for others. And I put true and good in quotation marks because even that is culturally determined or culturally defined. But for example, when somebody does something and says, and you're offended by it, and they say, but that's Filipino culture, okay? That's when culture fails to explain who you are as a person once somebody tries to manipulate it or to claim it to legitimize an action that you cannot accept. Okay? Also, culture can change. So you can't just have this frozen idea of what culture is and then say it's not my culture anymore or it's a dead culture. I reject that. Because it can change, and you yourself can contribute to its transformation. So that's it, and I hope I've confused you, since that was my objective, and that you leave this lecture with lots of things to think about, not just who am I, but who am I in relation to others. Thank you.